During the late 1970s, a DC-10 passenger jet crashed shortly after takeoff, killing all on board. Little did anyone know it at the time, but in the days leading up to the tragedy, one man's disturbing dream would turn out to be a nightmare premonition. What are dreams? It surprises most people to know that even in this modern age of unrelenting discovery and innovation, we still don't fully understand what these brief moments of unconscious awareness are, or why they occur. Some believe they are gateways into parallel universes, an alternate reality where everything is similar to our waking world, but not quite the same. Others view them with rationality and reason that they are part of an important brain function, the mind's way of deconstructing and deciphering everyday worries and stresses. It is said that we experience many things when we dream, and oftentimes we find a realm populated by our most secret fantasies. We envision being the person we wish to be, whether through fame and fortune, winning the respect of our peers, or something as simple as finding love. Our deepest desires tend to manifest in many ways throughout this process, but so too do our darkest fears. It is safe to assume that everyone has suffered a nightmare in one form or another at some point in their lives. More often than not, they are fleeting and rare, but unfortunately, far more vivid and at times, even dangerous. Each year, thousands of people report dreams becoming violent, resulting in cardiac arrest, unexpected seizures, or even physical injury. Born out of the stress and anxiety of our circumstance, nightmares are usually a good indication of what's going on in our personal lives, and some see them as a window into understanding how to fix whatever is wrong. Sometimes, however, they can take on a far more foreboding nature. In the late 1970s, one man would come to learn just how deadly dreams can be. David Booth, an office manager from Cincinnati, Ohio, lived a modest existence. He was married, earning a decent income, and raising two beautiful children, and for most of his life, he had experienced no major upheavals or problems. But all that would change in the early morning hours of Wednesday the 16th of May, 1979, when he awoke in a nervous sweat and rushed to his bathroom. His wife awoke with him and noticed his shocked expression. Concerned, she asked him what had happened, and reluctantly, he related to her what was to become the first in a series of recurring nightmares. David explained that in his dream, he was looking out to his right over a field, and there was a jet flying towards him, which wasn't making any sound. He said that it suddenly banked, with its right wing up in the air, turned over on its back so that it was flying inverted, and then flew straight into the ground and exploded. He awoke just as the noise from the explosion was dying. Despite how vivid and surreal the dream seemed to be, David did not feel that it had any significance. The next night, however, he would experience the same dream again. He described the plane and its fall in the exact same way as before, with more striking detail, and the impact of such a vision would leave him sobbing in his sleep. To his surprise, or rather horror, he found himself having the same dream again a third night later, and then a fourth, and then a fifth, and for a full 6 nights up to the 22nd of May. The same dream, the same plane, the same disaster, all just as he had witnessed the very first time. And as he continued to dream, David worried that the event was going to happen sometime in the near future. Without any clue as to when and where, he felt there was little he could do to prevent it from happening. Nevertheless, on the 7th night, he decided to act. The key detail that stood out to him was an instinctual feeling that the plane was connected with the then iconic American Airlines, one of the busiest in the country. David managed to get in contact with Paul Williams, manager of the Federal Aviation Administration office in Cincinnati, and proceeded to tell him about his bizarre dream. Rather than dismissing the young man's fears out of hand, Williams took the warning seriously and asked David for any information he could give, but the only thing he was aware of was that it was an American Airlines flight. Williams asked him to go through his dream in more detail, in the hopes that he could try to narrow down the possibilities of when and where the disaster would occur. Through this effort, David was able to provide several more clues regarding the plane, stating that it bore 3 turbine engines altogether, one on the tail end and one on each wing. Using these details, Williams ascertained that the plane was a DC-10 jet aircraft, but unfortunately, nothing further could be determined. Meanwhile, for David, the dream persisted for 3 more nights, and with each occurrence, he began feeling overwhelmed by the trauma of experiencing the same tragedy night after night. Around the same time that he informed Williams of his visions, David also contacted a psychiatrist in the hopes of obtaining treatment for his ongoing affliction, which was beginning to take its toll on his psyche and cause him to question his sanity. Williams, meanwhile, brought the information to a number of flight managers at several nearby airports, but because nothing useful could be gained from the apparent lack of details, no one was realistically in a position to do anything about it. The following night, on the 25th of May 1979, David envisioned the dream once again, but when he awoke, he had the distinct and unshakable feeling that this was to be the last time. Resigning himself to this notion, he left work early that morning with mixed feelings. Deep within his soul, he somehow knew that his affliction was over, and for that, he felt relieved. Yet also, deep within his soul, he knew that somewhere out there, a tragedy was imminent, and for that, he felt despair. At 3:05 p.m. that afternoon in Chicago, a DC-10 jet plane registered as Flight 191 took off from the runway at O'Hare International Airport, bound for Los Angeles. It took off normally and started its climb when, without warning, the plane rotated onto its side and flew out of control towards the ground. Despite attempts by the flight crew to correct its trajectory, they had completely lost control, and after only several minutes in the air, it came crashing down on the field to the left of O'Hare, almost precisely as David Booth had envisioned. A total of 258 passengers, its 13-man flight crew, and 2 persons on the ground were killed in the tragedy, resulting in the worst and deadliest aviation disaster to have occurred in the continental United States. When the investigation was conducted, it was discovered that the engine on the left wing had separated mid-flight and had struck the rear of the jet, destabilising its course and severing its hydraulic and electrical systems. This led to the slats on the left wing being jammed in position and resulted in the aircraft edging into an asymmetrical drag, which caused the right wing to lift higher than the left, ultimately inverting the plane and causing the loss of control. As if to heighten the mystery further, the last inspection, recorded on the 11th of May, 5 days prior to David Booth's dreams, showed that there were no existing problems, but these records were somehow lost in the aftermath of the investigation. The news hit David hard, and he almost suffered a nervous breakdown. In his own mind, He blamed himself for not doing enough to prevent the disaster. Although Williams and many other aviation officials assured him he had nothing to feel responsible for, David believed the lives of hundreds of people were lost that day because of his inability to act. A number of newspaper editors somehow learned of David's attempts to warn the FAA and his dreams foretelling the crash, and in the days that followed, they tried to contact him for his sensational story. He reluctantly gave a small number of interviews, which lasted only as long as the investigation into the crash. Afterwards, he all but disappeared from the media spotlight. As far as we know, David Booth never had any dreams of a similar nature ever again. Despite the horrific plane crash, O'Hare recovered from the disaster and continues even to this day to be a major airport within the United States. But gone from existence is the DC-10 jet aircraft. The crash of Flight 191 sounded the death knell for the plane, which many feel was not all that surprising in the slightest. Even before the disaster, the DC-10 was viewed as structurally insecure and had fallen victim to a number of faults and accidents. Of particular note was the crash of Turkish Airlines Flight 981 in 1974, which killed 346 people. The jet was decommissioned and phased out of service following one more fatal disaster in October of the same year, and in some ways, many feel David's dream actually foretold the end of the jet itself. What makes the tragedy rather unique is the apparent fact that David was not the only person to have an upsetting premonition about that particular flight. In recent years, the story surfaced that actress Lindsay Wagner, famous for her role in the TV series The Bionic Woman, had booked a ticket along with her mother to fly on Flight 191 to Los Angeles. Before boarding the plane, however, she was overcome by nausea, which she took as a warning that the plane was dangerous. She managed to convince her mother not to board the flight, and they stayed behind to witness the plane crash just moments later. Noted author and former editor of Playboy magazine, Judy Wax, and her husband unfortunately did board the aircraft and perished in the disaster. A few admirers of her work pointed out shortly after her death that her final book, Starting in the Middle, carried a line which expressed her fear of flying, on page 191, the same number as the doomed flight. So was all this merely a coincidence, or was something attempting to warn certain individuals that the plane was heading for tragedy? This brings us back to our question: just what are dreams? It is possible that some dreams do attempt to warn us of future events, and whilst there is still heated debate as to the veracity of precognitive dreams, some historic examples do exist which seem to support this idea. In 1858, Mark Twain reportedly had a dream in which he attended the funeral of his younger brother Henry, 2 weeks prior to the latter's death in a steamboat explosion. President Abraham Lincoln famously told one of his aides of walking into his own funeral 3 days before his assassination in 1865. In 1898, writer Morgan Robertson published a novel which told of a brand new transatlantic luxury liner, touted as unsinkable, which strikes an iceberg and sinks with a large loss of life in the month of April. The name of the ship in question? The Titan. Some reports allege that he dreamed up the concept, and to add further weight to this theory, a number of passengers who survived the wreck of the Titanic in 1912 even claim to have dreamed of disaster befalling the ship days or even hours before it took place. And finally, in October 1966, a little girl in the village of Aberfan, Wales, named Errol May Jones, related an experience where she dreamed something black coming down all over her school. The following day, a landslide of black wet coal slurry came crashing down onto the Pantglass Junior School, trapping and killing little Errol May and 115 of her schoolmates. At least 6 other persons in the surrounding towns and countryside were reported to have dreamed of the disaster just days before it took place. Most would argue that the majority of dreams and nightmares are not real to begin with, and whether pleasant or painful, rarely come true. Those that do are nothing more than mere coincidence. However, we can only ascertain that a nightmare lasting at least 10 days is strong evidence to suggest otherwise. If the case of David Booth is anything to go by, it also stands to reason that we should not take these dreams too lightly. One could argue that the alarming accuracy of some premonitions is rather telling. Something more is going on within these psychological processes. Philosophers, psychologists, and even scientists have postulated that what we perceive as reality is nothing more than a construct of the mind, that it does not exist outside of the body, but is created within the brain itself, an internal existence rather than an external one. For what if the thing you perceive as three-dimensional space is created solely within your mind? That everything you touch, taste, smell, see and hear is simply an electrical impulse detected and deciphered by your brain to give you only the illusion that what you perceive is real. After all, if you alter your senses regarding a particular object, does not your perception of that object's reality also change? And if we live by the rule that everything we perceive via our five senses, which incidentally are created and interpreted within the brain, is real, does this mean that our dreams, which are also created and interpreted within the brain, are also real? Could they be glimpses into an unconscious reality where every possible outcome is perceived, and that sometimes those outcomes manifest in our waking world? It is often said that life imitates art, but we would argue that art often imitates our dreams. Therefore, our dreams, and even our nightmares, are very much intertwined with our waking world. The question is, do our lives dictate the way we dream, or do our dreams dictate the way we live?